Stories from Upanishads and Puranas, retold by Rg Goswami. My dear friends and listeners, in today's episode, I'll narrate part 1 of the story of enmity and battle between two birds, Asi or Bankmana and Baka or Indian crane from Markandeya Purana, which led to almost destruction of the world. Please note that today's episode concentrates only on the prelude part of the story and the real interconnected web of reasons which led to this battle. Therefore, I will narrate accounts from our other scriptures such as Rig Veda, Ramayana and Mahabharata to establish the facts as described in those scriptures. The birds of wisdom asked Rishi Jaimini if he was eager to hear the account of a great battle between two birds and how it became the cause for destruction during sage Vishwamitra's Rajswa Yagya. The Rishi nodded in agreement and the birds continued their narration. After Raja Harishchandra went to heaven, Suryavamshi Guru, the great sage Vashishthas, arose from inside the river Ganga after 12 years. As soon as he emerged from the river, he came to know everything about Raja Harishchandra. He came to know about how sage Vishwamitra tricked and tested the king in the name of Dharma, truth and promise and made him suffer like no one else. He came to know how the most righteous king was put into a terrible test, making him lose everything, even himself. As he learned more and more about sage Vishwamitra's involvement in the atrocious fate of Raja Harishchandra, he grew angrier and angrier at his counterpart. He couldn't bear the event when Harishchandra was forced to sell off his wife, son and himself and lead a life of a Chandal just to pay off his debt and keep his promise. Friends, the beauty of our scriptures in Sanatan is that these stories are layered and continuously evolve through time and age, as these can be referenced through multiple scriptures and documents. All these stories and accounts are linked up with each other, thus presenting a huge bouquet of scriptures which must be read thoroughly to understand the end-to-end account. Reason behind this is the concept of the Shrutis and the Smritis. The thinkers, sages, and writers of these great scriptures and texts had added in their thoughts and writings through various ages and eras, adding on their bit to make it more and more relevant to that period. Let me try to explain why sage Vashishthas went underwater into a deep meditation for 12 years. As told earlier in my episode on Raja Harishchandra, the test on the king was a divine plan by the gods. Sage Vishwamitra was selected to carry out that test. Understanding the divine plan, sage Vashishthas chose to remain underwater for 12 years during that period. He wanted to respect the divine strategy and wanted to avoid direct confrontation and interference in sage Vishwamitra's intense spiritual challenge. It was a gesture of respect for the divine plan and the way to maintain the cosmic balance. Sage Vashishthas, being deeply wise and spiritually advanced, understood that his presence might disrupt the karmic unfolding of Harishchandra's trials and Vishwamitra's spiritual journey. This episode highlights the depths of spiritual discipline and mutual respect among sages, even amidst rivalry. It also underscores the importance of allowing Dharma to unfold without obstruction. However, sage Vishwamitra and sage Vashishthas were two most powerful sages in Hindu mythology, known for their long-standing rivalry. Sage Vashishthas couldn't see sage Vishwamitra eye to eye, although both being Brahma Rishis. Another point to be clarified here, when I take the name Vashishthas or Vishwamitra, it may not mean the same individual sage. What it means is that an individual or a sage carrying the same gotra of Vashishthas or Vishwamitra, or they may be direct descendants of these sages. In this way, Vashishthas or Vishwamitra became not just a person but a post, and there were many famous lineages of Vashishthas and Vishwamitras who used to exist in different eras. I'll create a separate content on this topic as I believe this topic will deviate me from the current story. On researching further on the topic of rivalry between these two sages, I could find three distinctive accounts from Ramayana, Mahabharata and Rig Veda which throws in some light on this subject. The first, King Kaushika Gadi's attempt to abduct Kamdhenu or Nandini from sage Vashishta. Second, the curse of King Kamalashpada. Third, association of King Sudas with sage Vashishta instead of sage Vishwamitra. Let's understand each of this account in detail. The account of King Kaushika Gadi's attempt to steal Nandini or Kamdhenu from the ashram of sage Vashishta is mentioned in Balkhanda chapters 51 to 56 of Valmiki Ramayana. The account says like this. One day, King Kaushika Gadhi of Gadhipura or Kanyakubja belonging to Kushika dynasty went hunting in the forest near Mount Meru. After a long hunting exercise, he was exhausted and tired. At that time, he happened to reach the divine ashram of sage Vashishta II or Devraj Vashishta. Friends, remember, I set a context earlier about the lineages of these great sages. I have tried to align the time period of these sages to come to a comparative timeline of when they existed on the face of this earth. Continuing with the account. Sage Vashishta was well known for his powers and spiritual wisdom. Seeing the exhausted king and his large army, the sage welcomed them into his ashram, and after a bit of resting, the sage offered the king and his army to have some food. When the king agreed, the sage arranged a lavish feast, allowing each member and soldier to eat to their heart's content. While eating such magnanimous and well-spread feast, the king thought, how did the sage manage to arrange such huge amount of delicious food for the entire army? Unable to control his curious mind, the king, with folded hands, asked the sage, "O great sage, how have you managed to conjure such lavish, well-spread feast in such a secluded forest? Is there some divine or celestial power bestowed upon you?" The sage smiled and calmly replied, "O King Kaushik, let me tell you, there isn't any divine or celestial power bestowed upon me. All this magnificent food spread is arranged by Nandini, my Kamdhenu cow, which was gifted to my ancestor by gods during Samudra Manthan. Nandini can produce all kinds of riches and sustenance at my command." Hearing this, the king thought, if this cow can feed an entire army, then it would be really helpful if this cow is kept with me. Then, with folded hands, conveyed the idea to the sage. He said, "O great sage, I would be grateful if you give me this cow. In exchange, I will give you 10,000 herds of cattle or even my entire kingdom. I'll use it to feed my soldiers and citizens." The sage calmly denied. Then again the king demanded this cow from the sage. The sage refused and said, "This sacred cow is essential for my sacrifices and for sustenance of my hermitage. She is not for sale, even for all the wealth in the world." The king was unhappy with the sage's answer. Suddenly he got up and ordered a few of his men to drag Nandini with them. The men tied a rope around the neck of the cow and started to drag her out of the ashram. During his struggle, Nandini spoke out to the sage, "O revered one, why do you allow me to be taken away? Have I failed to serve you?" The sage replied to the cow, "O pious one, if you do not wish to be taken away from me, use your divine powers to stop the men from taking you away." With Vashishthas' permission, Kamdhenu created a huge army of celestial warriors. Her tail produced the Pallavas, her udders, the Dravidas and Shakas, her womb, the Yavanas, her froth and dung brought forth Pondras, Kiratas and Kanchis. Upon witnessing the unexpected advance of a formidable celestial army, King Kaushika Gadi commanded his own forces to engage in a battle. The ensuing conflict was intense and ultimately resulted in defeat of king's troop. Confronted with loss and humiliation, King Kaushik Gadi recognized the predominance of spiritual strength over the royal might, the ascendancy of Brahma Tejas. Returning to his kingdom, the king resolved to pursue the path of a rishi in search of spiritual power. His determination to attain aesthetic wisdom signified the transformation from a monarch to a rishi or a sage. King Kaushik Gadi became sage Vishwamitra. To achieve his goal, he renounced his throne and devoted himself to rigorous penance or tapasya. After years of austerity, he was blessed by Lord Shiva, who imparted to him the knowledge of celestial weaponry. Equipped with newfound spiritual prowess and divine armaments, sage Vishwamitra subsequently confronted sage Vashishthas once more in an effort to obtain Nandini. However, sage Vashishthas counterattacked using Brahmadanda, thereby neutralizing sage Vishwamitra's celestial arsenal. After repeated failed attempts to defeat sage Vashishthas, Vishwamitra recognized that mastering ego, anger and desire was the key to spiritual growth. Intensifying his penance, he progressed from a rishi to a Raj Rishi, then to a Maharshi, and finally elevated to the position of Brahmarshi. This was the first account where we found how antipathy between the both great sages started. Next clash was documented in Adi Parva and Vana Parva of Mahabharata. The account is of how King Kamlashpada of Ishkwaku dynasty was cursed by sage Vashishthas' eldest son Shakti Vashishta, and how cleverly Vishwamitra used that curse to make Kamlashpada his disciple. However, note that Vishnu Puran, Shiv Puran, Bhagavad Puran, Agni Puran, Vayu Puran and Padma Puran all have the same story mentioned, but each with some differences in details of the curse and its consequences. I'll narrate this account from the Mahabharata. Sage Vishwamitra always wanted to make King Saudasa Kamlashpada his disciple. However, historically, Vashishthas were always gurus of Ishkwaku kings. King Saudasa Kamlashpada was a powerful and virtuous king and was known for justice and strength. However, one fateful day, his life was about to take a very tragic turn. One day, while hunting in a dense forest, he was walking through a very narrow forest path. As he was in the middle of the narrow forest path, he saw a young rishi coming from the opposite direction. The narrow forest path would only allow one of them to pass through. When King Kamlashpada came face to face with the young rishi, he came to know that he was Rishi Shakti Vashishta, the eldest of the 100 sons of sage Shrishtabhaja Vashishta. However, blinded by his obsession of royalty and strength, the king demanded that the young rishi move aside and must make way for him. The king, beholding the young rishi, shouted, "Stand out of our way!" The rishi calmly told the king, "This is my practice. It follows the timeless moral principles found in the text on duty and religion that a king should ever make way from a Brahman." They discussed their mutual rites of passage in a measured manner. Each requested other to stand aside. The sage, confident in his rightful claim, refused to yield, while the king, motivated by pride and anger, also declined to give the way. This was leading to an unnecessary altercations and arguments between the king and the young rishi. In a fit of rage, like a demon, the king hit the young rishi with a whip. This was the pinnacle of an unnecessary fight, as the rishi in the fit of rage cursed the king. "O worst of kings, you have hit an ascetic like a demon. So from now on, you shall become a Rakshas or a cannibalistic demon who will only survive eating human flesh." At that very moment, sage Vishwamitra was also passing by the forest and heard them fighting and arguing for the right of way. He saw an opportunity to make King Kamlashpada his disciple and morally defeat the Vashishthas. Fearing that this minor difference would get resolved soon, he summoned a fierce demon by the name of Kinkara and commanded him to enter the body of the king in obedience to Shakti's curse. Once the demon possessed the king's body, Vishwamitra quickly left the place, leaving Shakti and the possessed king. Shakti, who was very hungry, asked the king for a food with the meat. The king promised to provide it after returning and told Rishi to wait for a while. Later, remembering his promise at midnight, Kamlashpada instructed his cook to find the Rishi in the forest and give him a meal with meat. The cook, unable to find meat, reported to the king, who, being possessed by a Rakshas, ordered him to serve the Rishi a meal with human flesh. The cook complied, but when Shakti Vashishtha sensed that the food was unholy and unworthy of eating, he cursed the king again to crave for human flesh and wander in this earth, troubling others. The repeated curse caused the king to lose his senses under the Rakshasa's influence. Deprived of all his senses by the Rakshasa within him, the king, upon seeing Shakti, who had cursed him, declared, "Because of you have pronounced this remarkable curse on me, I shall commence my life as a cannibal by consuming you first." He then immediately slew Shakti and devoured him, much like a tiger preying on his chosen victim. Witnessing Shakti's demise, Vishwamitra persistently incited the Rakshasa, inhibiting the king against the remaining sons of sage Vashishtha. Consequently, the Rakshasa soon consumed all other sons of Vashishtha. Upon learning that all his sons had perished at the instigation of Vishwamitra, Vashishtha endured his sorrow with patience, akin to a steadfast mountain bearing the weight of the earth. The wise sage, resolute in ending his life rather than harming Vishwamitra, leapt from Mount Meru but survived, as if it were cushioned. He tried walking into the blazing fire and drowning in the deep sea, yet all these attempts failed to end his suffering. Unable to die, he returned, troubled, to his hermitage. Later on, the grief-stricken sage Vashishtha, bereft of his children, wandered all over. His daughter-in-law, Adrishanti, carrying Shakti's child, followed him. Near the banks of Vipasa and Shatudri rivers, her unborn child recited the Vedas, which relieved Vashishtha of sorrow and grief. He refrained from self-destruction and returned to his ashram with Adrishanti. There they met the cursed king Kamlashpada. The king was in a horrible state, grieved, ashamed of his heinous deeds, and wanted to get rid of this Rakshasa within him. The sage sprinkled sanctified water and chanted holy mantras and relieved him from the curse and drove the Rakshasa away from the king's body. Grateful, the king pledged never to offend rishis again and requested for a son to continue Ishkwaku lineage. Vashishtha agreed, and after returning to Ayodhya, the queen Madhyanti conceived through sage's blessings. However, the gestation period was 12 long years. In frustration, the queen lost all her patience and cut open her womb with a stone, resulting in the birth of Asmaka, their heir of the Ishwaku dynasty. That was the second account from the Mahabharat, when both the sages clashed against each other. The third account is from the old books of Rg Veda, and it's about the king Sudas of Tritsu Bharata clan. According to Bharata genealogy, King Ajamida's line split into three: Nila, Kanva and Raksha. Nila's descendants settled in North Panchal and were ancestors of King Drupad, possibly forming Tritsu Bharata tribe. Raksha's descendant Emperor Kuru established the Kuru Bharatas, forebearers of Pandavas and Kauravas in the battle of Mahabharat. King Sudas of Tritsu Bharatas was a young, ambitious leader who ruled central Sapta Sindhu and Ganga Yamuna Dwab, an area with thriving cities and diverse population. Seeking to expand his domain, he aimed to conquer territories beyond the river Parusani, then under Anu's or Anava rule, to gain control over the powerful waters of Sapta Sindhu. Mandala 7th of Rig Veda, composed by Vashisthas Varuni, aided Sudas in defeating the coalition of over 10 kings during the Battle of 10 Kings. Vishwamitra Gathin, author of Mandala 3rd of Rig Veda, was also briefly associated with Sudas in his campaigns beyond Sindhu River. Both served Sudas as priests at different times for separate conquest. An interesting point to note is that famous linguistic historian Mr. Shrikant Talageri has pointed out that Mandalas 3rd, 6th and 7th are early family mandalas primarily written in praise of various Bharata rulers such as Divodasa and Sudas. Mandala 3rd was composed by Vishwamitra Gathin and it houses notable hymns such as Gayatri Mantra. So, sage Vishwamitra Gathin is considered to be the composer of Gayatri Mantra. Mandala 6th is considered to be the oldest Rigvedic book. This mandala was composed by the family of sage Bharadwaja Brihaspatya and predominantly praises King Divodasa. Mandala 7th was composed by Vashisthas Maitra Varuni. The point to note that these hymns were composed by different priests at different times. Hence, we do not know which hymn predates which, and as two mandalas fall under the oldest of the core books of Rig Veda. Merely going by the mandala chronology and the hymn numbers, the hymn composed by Vishwamitra Gathin in Mandala 3rd might have been written earlier than the hymns composed by Vashishtha Maitra Varuni in Mandala 7th. So in that context, King Sudas might have started his conquest towards the area near the rivers Vipas and Sutudri, and then he might have ventured into capturing lands beyond Sindhu. After being crowned as the king of Tritsu Bharata lineage, King Sudas wanted to consolidate his territory, which originally started near Saraswati Drishtavati rivers. To control the geographical landmasses, rivers, cattle and thriving economy of Sapta Sindhu and Ganga Yamuna Dwab region, he may have extended his territories towards west near the rivers Vipas and Sutudri, and later further towards the northwest in and around rivers Sindhu, and then turned east towards Kikatas or Magadha. These conquests were achieved under the priesthood of Vishwamitra Gathin. Later, when Vashishtha Maitra Varuni took over the mantle of priesthood, King Sudas started expanding his control first towards the east near the river Yamuna and then towards the west near river Parushani. These expeditions led into a deadly war called Dasarajna Yuddha as mentioned in Rig Veda. The Dasarajna was just not a war or a battle which might have taken place one fine day. Rather, it was built upon a series of interconnected events that finally led to this war. This chain of events took place throughout Suda's reign. The initial conquest under the priesthood of Vishwamitra Gathin may be precursor to main Dasarajna war. Later, when king fought Dasarajna Yuddha under the priesthood of Vashishtha Maitra Varuni, the chain of events tied to each other changed the dynamics of the land and interrelationships between the various clans and tribes, which led to this great war. Perhaps it was the forgotten epic that was never told and never immortalized as our other popular itihasas like Ramayana or Mahabharata. Early on his career as a ruler of Tritsu Bharata clan, King Sudas started his conquest under priesthood of Vishwamitra Gathin. The sage helped him to conquer lands beyond rivers Sutudri and Vipasa and later Sindhu. Sudas had also brief strife with Kikatas. All these events are recorded in Mandala 3rd of Rig Veda. The evidential proof of this can be deduced from the fact that Vishwamitra Gathin is credited as the chief composer of Mandala 3rd Suktas. As per Mandala 3rd, hymn 33, slok 11, sage Vishwamitra Gathin crossed the river Sindhu along with his clan of Kusikas and composed these hymns in praise of rivers Vipas and Sutudri to allow passage for his people, the Bharatas. Later in Mandala 3rd, hymn 53, slok 11 and 12, once again Vishwamitra Gathin becomes the royal priest of Titsu Bharata King Sudas. He emboldens the king to perform an Ashwamedha Yagya and challenge the kings nearby to accept him as their emperor and pay their homage to him. However, Sudas's ambition heightened and manifold. He wanted to control beyond the river Sindhu. Ashwamedha Yagya must have ruffled the feathers of the neighboring kingdoms and clans. Sudas had gained a lot of territories near Vipas and Sutudri rivers. However, Rig Veda does not provide much details on these conquests, although we don't find any reference to Sudas' conquest in Vipas and Sutudri in Puranikas. We can speculate that while returning from the conquest on the banks of Vipas and Sutudri, Sudas and his army might have faced Kikatas and their king named Pramagandha in the Eastern theatre. Many scholars think that Pramagandha is the name of the king who was connected to ancient Bihar, which was called Magadha, which was also known as Kikatas, as two words have been synonyms in the later text. The important takeaway is that this conflict, although not very elaborated in Rig Veda, but can be thought as one of the precursors to Dasarajna war under priesthood of Vishwamitra Gathin. Sudas's hunger to conquer lands in all directions might have originated from this conflict. After his conquest with Kikatas, he might have moved back to his capital, Achichatra, along with his army. Perhaps this was the time when he and his army recuperated from the long wars and their travel through the demanding topographies. After reaching his capital, he might have replenished his weapons, armor, and facilities. This cool-off period might have lasted for several years. During this period, perhaps Sudas thought of appointing Vashishtha Varuni as the head priest instead of Vishwamitra Gathin. Rig Veda does not tell us the real reason for his change of priest. The reasons remain unknown and open to various speculations. Vashishtha Varuni has been credited with composing hymns in Mandala 7th. These hymns in Mandala 7 beautifully describe the Dasarajna war. Although the sage has praised Indra and thanked him for aiding Sudas in the war, the hymns describe the confederation of more than 10 kings against whom the Tutsu Bharata king Sudas waged the war. As the name states, Dasarajna Yuddha literally means War of 10 Kings. These hymns can be considered to the level of an epic. Perhaps this was the great war sandwiched between two greatest itihasas of India, the period of Ramayana when Ramchandra Dasharathi battled the great Asura emperor Dasagriva Ravana, and the great war of Mahabharat in which Pandavas fought their cousins Kauravas for the throne of Hastinapur. Perhaps this was an epic in making, a story of ambition, grit and determination, a story of struggle and determined war against a huge army. A story of living one's dream, a story that shaped Bharatvarsha. Perhaps we can tell Dasarajna as the second epic after the great Ramayana. This was Dasarajna Yuddha, or the War of 10 Kings. For hymns, it seems that King Sudas fought the Dasarajna Yuddha in two different theatres with two different set of opponents. First war was smaller in magnitude on the banks of river Yamuna and then followed by the main war of Dasarajna, which was fought on the banks of river Parusuni. Thus, this evidence recorded in Rig Veda also confirms that somehow, for unknown reasons, the priesthood of Bharata clan was handed over to Vashishthas Maitra Varuni from Vishwamitra Gathin by King Sudas. That's it, my friends. These three accounts confirm the long history of antipathy between Vashishthas and Vishwamitras over the ages and eras. In my next episode, I will narrate the story of Asi and Baka, which could not be understood without understanding the basis of enmity between these two lineages of sages. Please leave a review, comment, like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to write to me at arghythings@gmail.com and visit my website https www.storiesfromupanishads and Puranas.com. Until then,
Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
stories from Upanishads and Puranas are available both as video and audio podcast formats on various platforms. The video format is only available on YouTube in my channel Stories from Upanishads and Puranas. You can listen to the audio podcast in almost all popular podcast platforms. I'll put in the links to the various platforms in the show notes below.